Welcome, everyone, to the quarterly Cannabis and Hemp Research Initiative panel. Today, I am talking to Elisa from the William J. Hughes Center for Public Policy at Stockton University. And let's just go ahead and start out. And would you please introduce yourself and then briefly explain the work that you do at the William J. Hughes Center for Public Policy at Stockton?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. As you said, my name is Alyssa. I am the research associate at the William J. Hughes Center for Public Policy here at Stockton. And my primary role is managing the Stockton Polling Institute. So really the mission of the Hughes Center is essentially to promote civic engagement. We want to provide a forum for discussion of all kinds of policy topics that impact New Jersey residents, and ultimately encourage active civil participation in civic life. And so one way to get people involved is to ask them what they think, bring the public into this discussion and give them a voice. And so that was really the impetus for creating the Stockton Polling Institute here at the Hughes Center. So the Polling Institute conducts statewide public opinion research on a wide variety of topics that impact residents. And our most recent poll happens to be all about the cannabis industry, with a few questions about the breweries as well.
Very good. And to backtrack for a moment, my name is Rob Mejia, and I am a teaching specialist at Stockton University in cannabis studies. And these quarterly panels are something we've been providing for about 3 years. We always make them free. We try to pick different subjects, and it was so timely that Stockton had done a research project here. So my next question is, what led you to do a research study about cannabis?
Yeah, so, one of the things that goes into deciding what topics to poll on is, what's relevant, what's timely, because we want to provide public opinion insights that are going to add value to the public discourse. We want the information to be useful for decision makers when they're crafting policy, or if a policy has already been implemented, to see, how the public is responding to that policy. So when we saw that the New Jersey Cannabis Regulatory Commission had approved rules around cannabis lounges in New Jersey, we thought it would be a good opportunity to see, where the public stands on that. And we kind of just build the poll out from there. And it also gave us a chance to see what people were thinking about the recreational market now that it's been open for a year. And it gave us an opportunity to re-administer some questions that we had asked a year prior. Because just before recreational sales started last year, we included some questions in one of our polls about the cannabis industry, to see if people would approve of recreational retailers in their town, if they support expanding cannabis tourism in New Jersey and things like that. So building a poll around cannabis, we thought, it also gives us a chance to track public opinion over time and get a longitudinal look at, opinion on these cannabis topics.
Yeah, very smart idea. And I was actually surprised to see that in the 1 year that New Jersey has sold over $500 million worth of cannabis. Pretty amazing. And actually, it looks like with all the new businesses and dispensaries that are opening, we could be well on our way to seeing a billion-dollar market next year. So if you do another poll next year, we'll see what those numbers look like. But it is definitely a very exciting time. So your study focused primarily on the New Jersey legal cannabis market and industry, but you also looked at New Jersey breweries. Why did you want to study New Jersey breweries at the same time?
Yeah, so, since we kind of started looking at those cannabis lounge restrictions, that's sort of where we started with the poll. And the restrictions that we asked about were, one, that the lounges would have to be run by licensed retailers, two, that alcohol and tobacco use would be prohibited, and three, that food sales would be prohibited. Those were the, general restrictions that we asked about. And that last one in particular, barring food sales, impacts New Jersey breweries as well. And that's something that breweries have really come out against, saying that it was a burden on their businesses. So we thought, hey, this might be an opportunity to ask what people think about those brewery restrictions as well. And, there really are similarities between the two industries. I mean, we know from our poll that almost 90% of cannabis users use it recreationally, at least some of the time. So, we're talking about with both of these industries, recreational activities, often social activities, where, substances are being consumed. So it didn't seem like too big of a leap to ask about those restrictions on breweries as well, in a cannabis poll.
Can New Jersey breweries even sell bottles of water?
I imagine that would fall under the I imagine that would be prohibited as well under the restriction. Yeah, they're that no food sales, and they can't coordinate with vendors either, like food trucks, and they also have limits on their special events per year too. So there's quite a couple of restrictions that we included in our question on that.
Interesting. It does look like when the cannabis consumption lounges start to roll out that they will be able to make some sort of deals with food trucks, local restaurants, because there can
Mm.
be food in the lounge, but it can't be something that is prepared at the lounge, at least for now. There are people who are trying to get some single serving options going, but in the meantime, you'll probably have food trucks that will pull up in front of the facility, and then I wonder how delivery will work. But I do think it's interesting that we do see those parallels.
Yeah.
What do you think? What was the biggest surprise about your poll?
I think for me, it was how universally satisfied the people were who had purchased from retailers. Because, opinions often vary. You look at any review page of a service or retail industry, and it can be a little divisive. And especially because it's such a new industry, I think I would understand if there were some growing pains. But 86% of the people who have purchased from retailers were satisfied with their buying experience. So that was a pretty good consensus that I think was a bit surprising. And then also another prior that I had was about cost. I know we've seen a lot of coverage about the cost of cannabis in New Jersey relative to other states. And don't get me wrong, it wasn't a plus on the in the column for retailers. Nobody was really saying that price was a big selling point for retailers in our poll, but it wasn't as big of a deterrent as we would have thought.
I can imagine because for those people who have never been in a dispensary or don't know pricing, right now in New Jersey, pretty much the average price of an eighth of an ounce of cannabis is between $50 and $60. So you're looking at $400 an ounce. If you compare that even to Massachusetts, that's been around about 4 years prior to us, they are about half the price. And then if you look at places like Colorado, Oregon, and California, they just shake their heads when they see the New Jersey prices because they are sometimes at about a quarter of the price. And of course, a lot of other choices, but a lot of that is because we're just getting started and there's very few cultivators right now, especially independent cultivators. So we can expect to see the price drop. But I would have thought that everyone would have been in just an uproar about that because it is pricey. I mean, New Jersey leads in a lot of categories. I'm sorry to say we lead in price of cannabis right now.
Absolutely.
So since your center focuses on public policy, did any of the results suggest new policy options to you?
I mean, it's not something that we've done independent research on. And we really see our role at the Hughes Center as providing a forum to discuss all different policy areas and different angles. And so that's sort of how we see our role. And particularly with the Stockton Polling Institute and our polls, we see our job as kind of providing a microphone for New Jersey residents and amplifying their voices in the conversation. But we do also bring subject matter experts together for events. I know one that comes to mind recently, we did a panel on youth mental health in New Jersey, just looking at that issue and discussing different ways to address that problem in New Jersey. And we also have a series of events coming up about policy that impacts Puerto Rico. So perhaps there's an opportunity to do that in the cannabis space as well and bring subject matter experts together. But for now, we see our poll as a way to bring residents' voices into the conversation.
Interesting. And for those of you that didn't know, Puerto Rico actually does have a medical cannabis program. They do not have any adult use, although with all the tourism they bring in, that would certainly be a very big boon to Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
So in 2022, as I mentioned, New Jersey cannabis market sold $555 million worth of products. This was done with only 37 dispensaries open. And dispensaries, of course, are the retail operations. As our market grows, how do you predict this will impact future poll results?
Yeah, so I imagine we'll see some exposure effect there. People will become more favorable toward things that they're exposed to and more familiar with. So, as more locations open up and as people see them pop up in their own town or in their local area, and they become more exposed to it, it'll become more normalized. And so, I imagine that would have an impact on public opinion. Because we see when we break down our poll results, we see that out of the people who do use marijuana regularly and have in the past year, they overwhelmingly support the cannabis industry. The questions that we asked about cannabis tourism and having recreational retailers in your town. But when you look at the group that that hasn't consumed any cannabis in the past year and doesn't regularly use marijuana, the support for the cannabis industry was the minority opinion among that group. So as we see more locations pop up and as that group becomes more exposed to it and familiar with it, I imagine we'll see favorability rise among that group.
And when you talk about people that don't use cannabis, did they also know that CBD, which is cannabidiol, and it is an element in cannabis that does not get you high, and it's most often present in things like topical lotions and balms. So people who really do a lot of sports, you get aches and pains. You play pickleball, for example, you get the sore knees or whatever. You can actually use that ointment, and it helps to resolve the inflammation naturally. When people responded to your poll, did they know that CBD was a way to consume cannabis as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's something that I wanted to make sure when we asked these questions that I was clear that any cannabis products, that's what we're talking about here. So, tinctures and CBD gummies, things like that. I wanted to make sure that we capture that. So I definitely made sure to ask about all cannabis products and not specifically marijuana, in our poll.
I'm glad you mentioned that because when I read a quick review, it sounded like it was mostly inhalation. So I
Absolutely.
thought the questions were mostly about lighting and smoking a joint or perhaps using a vape. But I didn't know that you also covered things like some of the tinctures, the topicals, concentrates, the limited edibles that we have in our market as well. So
Yeah.
that is very good to know. So of the 22 states that allow for legal cannabis adult use, only New Jersey and Delaware do not allow citizens to home grow their own cannabis, whether for medical purposes or for adult use. My question for you is, when New Jersey allows home grow, and there actually is a little bit of momentum for that to happen, how do you think it will impact our cannabis market?
I imagine it won't have much impact on the retail market. And we see some evidence of that in other states where home growing is permitted. The cannabis sales continue to increase per capita and the industry continue to grow. So, and also I sort of have a gut assumption that not everyone who consumes any sort of cannabis products wants to, deal with the intricacies of doing it at home. And there's time and there's labor involved. And you think about there's so many other products that can be produced at home, and yet those industries continue to thrive. So while home growing would certainly benefit a minority group that wants to engage in that and wants to produce it themselves at home, my assumption is that it would have a minimal effect on the retail market overall.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are seeing that in other states, and actually, people who do home grow, those are usually your biggest enthusiasts, and they're doing it for a couple reasons. So there are some states, and actually, the cannabis industry and market, and really some of the ethos behind it, is that people used to grow for other people. There's a huge culture of gifting, so that if I know a certain medical patient needs a particular strain, and I happen to be a good grower, one of the things that I do as part of my calling is I grow that particular strain and then I give it to that patient who needs it. So, especially on the medical side, and you can imagine, so if you're a medical patient and you need a particular type of cannabis, if it is not in your dispensary, and they do rotate out product as it becomes more popular, less popular, or maybe you need something high in CBD that's not in the dispensary, one of the things you can do is grow it for yourself or grow it for a friend or medical patient. So I do hope that New Jersey does take that on. And to your point, also, what happens is people will grow, but those are also big consumers, and they're not going to grow enough for their total consumption. And then also, dispensaries will always have more varieties. So even if you grow your own flower, are you going to take the time and make your own tinctures? You could. Are you going to make your own concentrates? Again, you could, your edibles, all those other things, but it's really not likely. So I do think that it's kind of overblown as to the impact that home grow would have on the retail market, and I do hope that we see that in New Jersey soon. Fingers crossed on that. The other
Yeah.
big thing is we have, I don't know if you know, but we have some pretty amazing penalties for growing cannabis. If you grow over 5 plants, you could be looking at a $25,000 fine and potentially some jail time. So we not only do not allow home grow, but if you do, you are facing some pretty severe penalties.
Yeah. It's interesting that you brought up the sharing aspect, because we did find that with some people who said that they haven't been to the retailers yet, and they also, for their reason why, they said that they just get it from other people. They don't buy it at all. So, that's a big aspect of people just kind of gifting. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So if someone is thinking about getting into the cannabis business in New Jersey, what lessons can they take from your poll?
I would stress the importance of convenience, because while price was certainly a factor in why people haven't gone to the retailers and why they buy from individuals instead, another big response that we received, or commonly cited response, was that there wasn't a location nearby. And in addition to that, there were some responses that fit into the other category, but were also related to convenience. When people say there isn't a location nearby, they're saying it's not convenient enough. I don't want to drive that far to go get it. And we got some other responses in the other category, also in a similar vein. People were saying that I go to the same person. I'm used to that. They have a routine that they're kind of settled into. So I think, we know that there's untapped potential here. There were 30% of people who use cannabis that still haven't gone to retailers and are buying it from individuals. So we know there's untapped potential, but I think you really have to make it convenient enough for them to shake up their routine that they're very settled into and used to.
And was there any way to determine what people thought was too far to travel? So I mean, in New Jersey, I know that certainly a trip that can take you 30 minutes sometimes can take you 2 hours just because of all the traffic we face. But was there kind of a general consensus on what's a distance someone would go?
No, but that's a really interesting follow-up. That would be really interesting to see how people are evaluating what's, just too much of a burden for them in terms of distance. And I imagine it also sort of depends where, the individuals that they're buying from, where are they? Because there could be a dispensary very close, but if where they usually are getting it is even closer, then that could impact that decision-making there too. So that would be an interesting follow-up.
Absolutely. I would also be curious to find out how many people who do buy from the underground or traditional or legacy market who have their suppliers come to them, because
Right.
that's actually quite popular as well. So when you talk about convenience, what's more convenient than texting someone and then setting up a time and they appear, at your doorstep or within a couple blocks versus
Absolutely.
driving X amount of time. So I know we'll find out answers to those questions as time goes on. So, two of the main reasons that New Jersey consumers said they were satisfied or very satisfied with their experience at a cannabis dispensary is because of safety and quality. With the rigorous testing that cannabis products must undergo, I understand why consumers would feel safe. I mean, certainly if you've looked at any of the labels, there is so much information in there, and you can always ask for what's called a COA or a certificate of analysis, which shows the actual lab results on the product. So I understand the part about safety. And if you have anything else to expand on that, that's great. And then my second part of that question is, but how do you think consumers were able to judge the quality of cannabis products?
That's sort of another area for potential follow-up. It can't say for sure what criteria they were using to evaluate the quality. It's not something we followed up with additional questions. But I would my assumption would be that it is solely based on things that they can evaluate with their own senses. Sort of like what we talked about with home growing, where you have maybe cannabis connoisseurs who would be, more willing and interested in doing that. But not everybody who is consuming is a connoisseur. They might not be as, digging into the biochemical makeup of what they're purchasing. And they're likely relying on just things that they can evaluate themselves with their senses, things like smell, how it makes them feel. And we have some evidence of that in the responses to, why people were dissatisfied with what they got at the retailers, some people use the other option to elaborate on their dissatisfaction. And some of the things I saw there were, answers like it was too dry. It didn't alleviate their pain. It didn't work well enough for their pain. I saw one person said that, something that they got out of state worked better for their migraines. So these are all things that they can feel. So I imagine that that is going to be the deciding factor when they're evaluating quality, as opposed to maybe, the nitty gritty kind of details of the makeup.
That is so interesting. So when people voiced their dissatisfaction and they said it was too dry, did they say that led to kind of a different effect, or that it burned too quickly, or there are other issues, or did they elaborate any further, or they just knew that it was kind of too crumbly?
Yeah, that one in particular, they didn't elaborate further, but I imagine, yeah, they had some sort of, they knew the issues that would lead from too dry of a product. So immediately, I'm sure, just based on the feel, they were just not satisfied with what they had purchased. So that's, again, this is another area that would be interesting for follow-up, to kind of see the criteria that people are using when they're evaluating that.
And I wonder if they looked at expiration date to see how close it was, because of course, as you get closer to expiration date, then you do have a chance that the product is going to be a little bit drier. Actually, one thing they found in some other markets, unfortunately, is that sometimes there's too much moisture. And one of the reasons for that is because the dispensaries can actually charge more. Because of course, as you weigh your product, if it has more water content in it, it's going to weigh more, so you'll actually end up paying more for your product.
Interesting.
And there is really an art and a science to curing the bud properly. So it does have just a little bit of moisture, but it's not too dry. It's also not too spongy. For those of you who are kind of new, one of the things you look at is if you were smoking a joint or a bowl, if it stays lit, if the ash is white, and if you don't hear any popping. If you hear some popping, that might mean sticks. It might mean you have some seeds in there, might be too much moisture. So you just got a quick cannabis 101 usage lesson there. So another factor I would suggest that leads to consumer satisfaction is the great variety of products that are available in dispensaries when compared to purchasing products from the underground or the legacy market. Did this factor register with consumers?
It didn't really register. I would say we had a very small sample of respondents who cited selection as a main reason that they were, pleased with the retailers. But to be fair, we did ask them to narrow it down to their top reason for satisfaction. So we did require them to narrow it down to one. So perhaps if we allowed them to list, multiple reasons, then selection would have factored into that. But as we asked the question, it really didn't register as kind of a primary source of satisfaction.
Interesting, because I do know that. Well, I should probably turn this question to you. What was the most popular reason why people visited the traditional or legacy market outside of convenience, or was convenience number one?
Convenience and price were up there. I know 18% said that they didn't go to the retailer because of price. And I believe convenience was even higher, especially if you count those other responses that weren't related to the distance of the location, but were still sort of in the same vein of convenience. I believe it was 30% that said there was not a location nearby. And then, of course, there are some additional responses that were similar in nature that can also be lumped in with convenience there.
Interesting, because I know that certainly, as you mentioned, safety is one of the things that leads people to a dispensary, but then also options in product. Because if you do go in the legacy or traditional market, maybe they won't have edibles, they may not have concentrates. They're certainly not going to have innovative products like nasal sprays or transdermals that we'll be seeing in New Jersey at some point as well. And those very specific types of products are things that do lead people to visit dispensaries because of their choices.
Yeah, and I wonder if that was sort of factored into the people saying quality, because I know the reason for going to the retailers was, like you said, safety was number one, and not far behind was quality of products. And so I wonder if selection and having just more to choose from sort of was related to quality for a lot of people. I could see that being, a sign of quality, having all your needs being met, basically.
Absolutely. So since the craft brewery market has been around longer than our adult use cannabis market, were there any lessons that you think that cannabis operators can learn from the craft brewers, or any other interesting similarities that you found? Anything that made you say, "Wow"?
Yeah, I guess we didn't touch on breweries too much, but I guess I was surprised by the number of people who have been to a brewery in the past year. It was about 30%. It was about the same amount of people who said that they have consumed any cannabis products in the past year, and yet breweries have been around much longer than the recreational cannabis market. So it was sort of interesting to compare that to the cannabis industry and see that they're kind of on par in terms of people who are patronizing these institutions. So that was sort of interesting because breweries have been around much longer, and it seems like cannabis has quickly caught up to that industry.
Absolutely. So one of the challenges that cannabis operators face in New Jersey is trying to find a location. I don't know if you were aware, but there's about 70% of the townships out of the 564 that we have that have opted out of the cannabis business, or they may only allow one or two classes, they may put a cap on. And then you also have all the zoning restrictions, which can sometimes work as a cap anyway. So my question for you is, one of the questions you asked was about whether people wanted dispensaries in their township. What were your findings there? And then are there any tips you can give to people who sort of want to make the case of, I would love to open a dispensary in my town. What should I be saying? What should I be doing?
That's interesting because those were the questions that we asked last year as well. So we were able to track that public opinion over time, which is always nice to get a longitudinal look. And opinion really didn't change much. In fact, support actually decreased very slightly. But in most cases, it was statistically insignificant. So I would say that public opinion has remained very stable around those questions. And it's about half. So I know last year when we asked, it was a slim majority said that they would support it in their own town and supported expanding, cannabis tourism in the state. And it's hovered just about the same in our poll this year. It's about half. And I guess I would just kind of circle back to what we talked to before, that it takes time to really for people to come around and exposure. So now that we have some dispensaries have been open for a year now, and people are becoming more familiar with the market, they're getting more exposure to it. I imagine that support will creep up as it becomes more normalized. So really, it takes time for it to become more familiar to people in the state.
And what did people think about cannabis tourism? And did you tie that specifically to the idea of consumption lounges? Or was it sort of a broader question? Because when you talk about cannabis hospitality and tourism, that can be anything from yoga to having infusions and then painting. It can work with athletics. It can be infused meals. I mean, it just goes, anything that you do for leisure, you can almost always add with cannabis and make it a part of cannabis hospitality and tourism.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'll just let me see here exactly what we cited, because I think we cited a couple examples when we were talking about cannabis tourism attractions. And we specifically cited consumption lounges or other experiences in popular tourist towns. So that's the only thing that we cited specifically, were consumption lounges as an example of what we mean. And we found that 48% were in favor in this year's poll. And last year, I want to say it was about 50%. So again, it's hovering just around half. And that has really remained stable from last year to this year. So that's sort of how we asked that question. 45% said they were opposed to embracing those sorts of attractions in New Jersey tourist towns. Yeah. And then when it comes to selling recreational weed in their own town specifically, this year we found that 53% would support it in their where they live. So that's again about the same as what we found last year. It's remains quite stable.
Did you have anyone that elaborated on why they would not like a consumption lounge or why they would like a consumption lounge?
No, we didn't have that follow-up, but I think it was really enlightening to break these results out by who people who consume cannabis products and people who don't. And so, like I said, among the people who consume cannabis products, it was overwhelming support for retailers in their town and for, cannabis attractions. And then when you go to the group that does not consume cannabis, we found that opinions were split, and the minority view was to support these things. So I think that's sort of the difference among them. It's people who maybe just don't know about that industry, they're just not plugged in or familiar with cannabis. They don't use it, and so when you're not familiar, you're not as likely to sort of embrace the unknown. It really comes down to more exposure, more familiarity, knowing people that maybe use cannabis products personally. That kind of tends to make you more favorable toward the issue.
That makes sense. And for our listeners who didn't know, so consumption lounges have to be either connected to a dispensary or they have to be on the same property as the dispensary. And of course, they have to have odor mitigation. They can't be visible you can't see the inside from the streets. And people can actually bring in their cannabis products. If you're a medical patient, you need something specific, you could actually bring it in. Or you can purchase something in the dispensary and then go in the lounge. But one of the reasons that they came about was there are so few places you can legally consume cannabis in New Jersey. If you own your own home, that's fine. If you have a landlord and you're renting, unless they're fine with you consuming, you can't. But you also can't in a hotel, on a sidewalk, at the beach, in your car. So essentially, the only place you can consume cannabis is your own home or somebody else who owns a home and says, yes, it's okay to consume here. So in some ways, some people looked at consumption lounges as a social equity question. So where can I legally consume? And then also for tourists. So we want tourists to come here. We bring them in, we give them cannabis, and then we say, well, there's nowhere for you to consume. So that's one of the reasons why we have the lounges as well. And look for Atlantic City to be a hotbed of cannabis lounges. There's going to be a couple that will be very big and should be open probably in, I would say, about 6 months. So the next question I have for you is, what question do you wish you had asked on your poll?
Yeah, so we actually touched on it here today. I would say home growing. That's something that we could have asked about, because ultimately we are limited with our polls. We can't ask too many questions. People are so busy. We got to, we have to make sure to keep it brief. But, asking about home growing is something that would be kind of a brief question that we could have included to gauge support for that. So that's something that in hindsight, I think we could have included to see where people stand on that.
And since you have a baseline of some questions this year, for next year, what results are you most looking forward to finding out about again?
I think it'll be interesting as cannabis lounges open up to maybe ask these questions and see if people change their opinion. Because I know the one restriction in particular that we asked about, prohibiting tobacco and alcohol use, people were actually pretty split on that. When it comes to requiring the retailers, requiring the lounges to be connected to retailers and run by retailers, people overwhelmingly supported that. The consensus was opposition to prohibiting food sales. So people, largely wanted food sales to be permitted. But on that restriction about tobacco and alcohol use, it was actually pretty split. So it'll be interesting that as the lounges open up, people will probably have a better idea of their opinion on that restriction in particular. And who knows, maybe opinion can change in these areas. So I think that'll be interesting to see.
A couple things we're seeing in other states is they're allowing for standalone consumption lounges. So in other words, you do not have to own a dispensary. You can actually apply just to have a lounge. So we're seeing that in Nevada. And they actually reserved 50% of their consumption lounge licenses for social equity applicants, which I thought was an interesting way to try to help people get into the business. But they would be like a bar, so they would stand alone that way. And I do think we might see those. The other thing I think that will be interesting is New York just announced that they are going to allow for temporary licenses for retailers to be able to sell cannabis at different venues. So, for example, and there'll be 30-day temporary licenses. So if I were a dispensary owner, I could support or sponsor a concert series. And so every weekend for 4 weekends, I could be the concert sponsor and I could also supply product there. So it's another way for dispensary owners to put their stamp on particularly leisure activities. And I would love to see New Jersey doing something like that, a temporary catering license. So you could have different meals, you could sponsor concerts, anything again with recreation. So keep your eye on that too, because I think there will be a number of people who will be pushing on standalone consumption lounges and then temporary licenses too, which make a lot of sense. I mean, you look at Atlantic City and they have a gigantic Fish concert. Can you imagine if they had a temporary license for that weekend? That would be a boon to a lot of people, I think.
Absolutely. That seems like a next step in the expansion of this market in the state. And I just wanted to circle back to that social equity piece that you mentioned, because I did actually see that pop up. And again, some of these other responses where people elaborated, it wasn't quite as commonly cited as some of the other things, but a couple people said that they won't buy from retailers because they want to support the little guy, and the retailers are all these big businesses. So I think, when you give people the opportunity to open dispensaries and not just large corporate entities, I think people will take notice of that.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. Although the strange loophole with that is the independents that are opening right now, guess where they get their product? So if I go into a somebody who's just opened up, we have so very few independent cultivators, processors, et cetera, that if you go on their shelves, you're going to see product from Curaleaf, GTI, Ascend, Verano. So you're basically getting the same product assortment that you are at the big ones. And it's a strange thing where the MSOs, the big operators, have been allowed to essentially warehouse and distribute when those licenses aren't even available now. But they're expanding their market through these independent operators because they have nowhere else to get product. So until we can really get the rest of our cultivation market up and our producers producing unique product, you're just going to see the same thing. So even if I am going to an independent operator, I'm still actually strangely helping an MSO because I'm ending up buying their product anyway. It's just on a different shelf at a different location. So
Yeah,
it's kind of a weird thing.
that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, always so many strange things in the world of cannabis. So wrapping up, do you have any final words about your poll, or what else should we know?
Yeah, I think I guess the last thing that I would just touch on is that it was nice to get an idea of who the consumers are, because we asked that question of who has consumed any cannabis products in the past year. We were able to kind of get a picture of who those users are and a demographic profile. So it's kind of interesting to see that men are more likely to be cannabis users. And there was a generational divide there. People under 50 were consuming at much higher rates than folks older than 50. So it's kind of interesting to get a picture of who we're talking about here when we're looking at consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this was fascinating. Thank you so much, Lisa Maurice, for telling us about the recent Stockton poll about adult use cannabis in New Jersey and a little bit about the New Jersey breweries as well. And already I'm looking forward to what you'll find out next year. And we'll see whether we do reach that $1 billion mark, which I think we actually might have a might have a good chance of doing so.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me.